Cold Earth, written by Ann Cleeves and read by Kenny Blythe. Chapter 1. The land slipped while Jimmy Perez was standing beside the grave. The dead man's family had come from Fula originally, and they'd carried the coffin on 2 oars, the way bodies were always brought for burial on that island. The pallbearers were distant relatives whose forebears had moved south to England, but they must have thought the tradition worth reviving. They'd had time to plan the occasion. Magnus had suffered a stroke and had been in hospital for 6 weeks before he died. Perez had visited him every Sunday, sat by his bed and talked about the old times. Not the bad old times, when Magnus had been accused of murder, but the more recent good times, when Ravenswick had included him in all their community events. Magnus had come to love the parties and the dances and the Sunday teas. He'd never responded to Perez's chat in the hospital, and his death had come as no surprise. The coffin was lowered into the grave before the landslide started. Perez looked away from the hole in the ground as the first earth was scattered on the coffin and saw the community of Ravenswick stretching away from him. He could see Hill Head, Magnus's croft, right at the top of the bank next to the converted chapel where Perez lived with his stepdaughter Cassie. Nearer to the coast was the kirk and the manse that had been turned into a private home, much grander than the kirk itself. There were the polytunnels at Gilsetter Farm and a tiny croft house hidden from the road. He didn't know who stayed there now. The school where Cassie was a pupil was further north, not visible from the cemetery, and hidden by the headland was the Ravenswick Hotel and a smart holiday complex of Scandinavian chalets. This was his home, and he couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The view was filtered by the rain. It seemed it had been raining for months. There had been talk of cancelling Up Helia 2 weeks earlier because of the weather, but the fire festival had never been stopped in peacetime and had gone ahead despite the storm-forced winds and the downpour. Now Perez turned his attention back to the minister's words, but at the same time he was remembering Fran, Cassie's mother, and the love of his life, who was buried here too. The landslide made no noise at first. The hill had been heavily grazed all year. Sheep had tugged at the grass, disturbing the roots, exposing the black peat beneath. Now, after months of deluge, water had seeped under the surface, loosening the earth, and it was as if the whole hillside was starting to move. The contour of the landscape changed, exposing the rock below. But at this point, Perez had turned back to look at the grave where Magnus Tate had just been laid to rest, and he had no warning of what was to come. The rumbling started when the landslide picked up speed and gathered boulders and stones from the field dikes. When it crossed the main road, it missed a car but ploughed into the small croft. Relentless as a river in flood, the mountain of earth moved with a power that flattened the outhouses of the tiny croft house and forced its way through the main building, smashing windows and breaking down the door. Perez heard the noise when it hit the house as a roar and felt it as a vibration under his feet. He turned at the same time as the other mourners. In Shetland, cemeteries are located by water. Before roads were built, bodies were carried to their graves by boat. The Ravenswick graveyard lay on flat land at the bottom of a valley next to the sea, in the shelter of a headland. Now, the steep valley was filling with mud and debris, and the landslide was gathering speed as it rolled towards them. The sound was so thunderous that the mourners had warning of its approach. They paused for a second and then scattered, clambering for higher ground. Perez put his arm round an elderly neighbour and almost carried him to safety. The minister, a middle-aged woman, was helped by one of the younger men. They were just in time. They watched as headstones were tipped over like dominoes and the landslide rolled across the pebble beach beyond and into the water. Fran's headstone was simple and had been carved by a friend of hers, a sculptor. It was engraved with the image of a curlew, her favourite bird. Perez watched the tide of mud sweep it away. Perez recovered his composure very quickly. There was nothing of Fran left in the grave, and he didn't need a stone to remember her by. He turned to check that everyone was well. He wondered what Magnus Tate, who had been a recluse for much of his life, would have made of the drama at his funeral. He thought Magnus would have given a shy grin and chuckled. He'd suggest that they all go back to the community hall for a dram. No point in standing out here in the wild, boys. No point at all. Because, except for the minister, the mourners were all men. This was an old-fashioned funeral, and women didn't go to the grave. They were a small group. While people had made more of an effort to get to know Magnus towards the end of his life, he had few contacts outside Ravenswick. Now they stood, shaken by the power of the landslide. From a distance, they would have looked like giant sheep scattered over the hillside, aimless and lost. Perez stared back up the bank. He was thinking that if the landslide had started a mile further north, the Ravenswick school would be as devastated as the Croft House, which looked as if it had been smashed by a bomb. The slide had missed the farm at Gilsetter and the old manse by less than that distance. He looked at the ruin. Who lives in there? He couldn't believe that anyone inside would still be alive. They'd be smothered by mud or crushed by the debris caught up in the slide. But he couldn't remember anyone living in the croft since Minnie Lawrenson had died. I think it's empty, Jimmy. Stuart Henderson's son stayed there for a while, but he moved out months ago. The speaker was Kevin Hay, a big, middle-aged man who lived at Gilsetter and farmed most of the Ravenswick land. Perez couldn't remember the last time he'd seen Hay in a shirt and tie, probably at the last Ravenswick funeral. His black hair was so wet with the rain that it was plastered to his forehead. It looked as if it had been painted on. It hasn't been let out. Accommodation was still so tight that at this time of year even holiday homes were rented to oil or gas workers. There were few empty houses in Shetland. Not as far as I know. Hay seemed less sure now. I haven't noticed anyone in there. No cars parked outside, but the sycamores and our polytunnels mean we can't see it from the house. Unlikely that it's occupied, then, Perez said. It would be hard to manage so far from town without a vehicle. The other mourners were now gathering together around the minister. She was calm and composed, and seemed to be taking charge. He supposed they were making plans for getting home. The cemetery car park was on higher ground and their vehicles were undamaged, but some lived on the other side of the slip. I'd like to check it out, though. There were sheep tracks running up the valley slopes, and Perez and Hay followed one of these. They looked down on the ruined house from above. Now the landslide had passed through, there was no sound but the rain, a strange, eerie silence after the reverberating noise caused by the slip. People had already called the emergency services, and soon there would be fire engines and police cars, but not yet. The main walls of the Croft House were almost intact, but the surge of the slide had weakened the inside walls and the roof had collapsed over half of the house, giving glimpses of the interior. Everything was black, the colour of the peaty earth. Perez slid further down the bank so that he could get a better view of the exposed rooms. Hay followed, but put a hand on Perez's shoulder. Don't get too close, Jimmy. The hill's not too stable. There could be another slide, and I don't think there's anyone to save in there. No point putting your life at risk. Perez nodded. He saw that the mourners had reached the car park and people were driving away north, carrying with them friends who lived to the south of the slide. He supposed they'd be moving on to the community hall. The women would have a spread laid out, no point wasting that, and they'd all be ready for a hot drink. We should join them, Jimmy, Kevin Hay said. Nothing we can do here. In the distance, they heard the sound of sirens. He looked back at the hill, worried about another landslide. You go. I need to stay anyway. Perez looked beyond the house. There'd been a lean-to shed on the back of the kitchen, and that had been completely destroyed. Glass and the corrugated iron roof would have been swept into the mud. Beyond it, though, a stone wall that separated the small garden from the open grazing beyond was almost undamaged. It seemed to have funneled the landslip through a gap where a wooden gate had once been. Nearest the space, the edges of the wall were ragged, eaten away like unravelled knitting, but beyond the gap on each side, they were quite solid. The tide of earth had deposited debris there, thrown it up on its way through. Perez saw a bedhead, a couple of plastic garden chairs that must have been stored in the lean-to, and something else, bright against the grey wall and the black soil. A splash of red, brighter than blood. He scrambled down the bank towards it. A woman's body had been left behind by the ebbing tide of earth. She wore a red silk dress, exotic, glamorous, not the thing for a February day in Shetland, even if she'd been indoors when the landslide swept her away. Her hair and her eyes were black, and Perez felt a strange, atavistic connection. She could be Spanish, like his ancestors of centuries ago. Kevin Hay was already walking back to the cars, and Perez stood alone with her until the emergency services arrived. Chapter 2. The landslide caused chaos. The main road from Lerwick to Sombra Airport would be closed for at least the next day, and just where the slip had been, there were no roads to set up a diversion. Flights into Sombra had been diverted to Skatsta Airport in North Mainland, which was normally only used for oil and gas-related traffic, but was now stretched to capacity. Business people fired off emails of complaint to the council, as if they could influence the elements, and then booked themselves onto the ferry. Power lines were down, the slide had snapped poles and dragged them from their foundations. In the south of the island, people lucky enough to still have them reverted to the little generators they had used before mains electricity, and which they kept for emergencies. Others made do with candles and paraffin lamps. The day after the incident, Jimmy Perez was busy. He was the boss, so it was mostly meetings, with the council to work on getting the road open as soon as possible, with social services to check that the vulnerable and elderly had food delivered to them, and that their houses were warm. Not exactly police work, but in the islands it was important to be flexible. He disliked being trapped in the police station and in endless discussions. And still it rained. So he looked out at the grey town, the horizon between the sea and the sky blurred with cloud. Today it hardly seemed to get light. The main focus of his colleagues was to identify the woman who'd been killed in the landslide. As far as they could tell, she'd been the only casualty. There were no pockets in the silk dress and no handbag had been found, so there was nothing to identify her, no credit card or passport. The fire service said it was too dangerous yet to go into the ruined house to search for belongings. The bottom of her face, her jaw and her nose had been damaged beyond recognition, and there were wounds to the back of her head. Perez thought she'd been gathered up by the moving hillside, tumbled and battered until she'd been left adrift at the stone dyke. Yet her forehead and her eyes had seemed oddly untouched. There were scratches and tears in the skin, but the structure of that part of the face had been left intact. Her dark eyes had stared out at him. Perez hoped that the first impact had killed her, knocked her out at least, so she'd had no knowledge of what was happening to her. He still felt the weird and irrational attachment that he'd experienced at the scene. They assumed she must have been staying in the croft house that had been half flattened and filled with black earth. On holiday, perhaps. Yesterday had been the eve of St. Valentine's, and in Perez's head she'd been trying on the red dress for her lover, making sure that she would look good for the following evening. Perhaps she'd planned to cook him dinner, something spicy and Mediterranean, made with peppers and tomatoes, as red as the dress. Perez knew all these were fantasies, but he couldn't help himself. He wanted a name for her. They still hadn't tracked down the owner of the house, though they did have a name for it. Tane. Apparently it had been inherited by a woman who lived in America from an elderly aunt. Word in the community was that she rented it out on an ad hoc basis. She had plans to do it up and didn't want to let it out long term. Robert Henderson, whose brother had been the last tenant, was enjoying a Caribbean cruise, and the brother himself was working in the Middle East. It was all frustrating and unsatisfactory. Perez knew there would be a logical explanation and that somebody would come forward to identify her, but at present the dead woman remained mysterious, fueling his imagination and making him feel ridiculous. Her body would be sent by ferry to Aberdeen for the post-mortem, and Perez hoped they could get a name from dental records once the pathologist James Grieve had started his work, but that could take days. And they needed some idea who she was before they could find her dentist. Perez didn't think there was any point checking in the islands. She wasn't local. He would have seen her in town or heard about the dark lady who lived on the edge of his community. Now he was between meetings. He'd made coffee and stared out of his window towards the town hall. Its bulk was a shadow against the grey sky. Sandy Wilson knocked and came in. "I've spoken to most of the estate agents in Lerwick. None of them managed the Ravenswick house or rented it out." "We need to track down the owner, then," Perez continued, looking out of the window at the rain. "The dead woman might have been their friend or relative. Do we still have no idea who it belongs to?" Sandy shook his head. "The person who might have had an idea is dead." "What do you mean?" "Magnus Tate. He would have grown up with Minnie Lawrenson, the old lady who used to live there. He might have been able to point us in the direction of the niece who inherited it." But Magnus had died after a stroke at the age of 85, and Perez suddenly realized that he still needed to grieve for the man. Magnus had been a part of his life for the past few years. The landslide cutting short the funeral had disturbed the natural process of mourning. At least Magnus had been laid to rest with some dignity, lowered into the ground before the cemetery had been inundated with mud. Perez had first met Fran, his fiancée, because she'd been Magnus's neighbour, and the crofter had arrived at Perez's door soon after Fran's funeral, looking as awkward as a shy child, clutching in his hand a bag of sweets he knew Cassie loved. "For the bairn. Yon wife was a good woman." Then he turned and walked down the bank to his croft, making no other demands, not expecting Perez to chat or to invite him in. The woman in the red dress couldn't have been the owner. After all, why not? Perez thought. He'd imagined the dead woman as exotic and Spanish, but perhaps an American woman would wear red silk too. Sandy shrugged. He didn't like to speculate in case he got things wrong. "And you're sure that nobody has been reported missing?" Perez thought the woman couldn't have been staying in the house alone, or if she was there alone, she had known people in the islands. February wasn't a time for a walking holiday or sightseeing, and if she was that sort of tourist, she wouldn't be dressed in the way they found her. She'd be wearing jeans and a sweater, woolen socks, even indoors. "When will they go in?" "Soon," Sandy said. "Before it gets dark. They've got a generator set up, but they'd rather start during daylight." Perez nodded. "You be there, Sandy. But before you go, talk to Radio Shetland about putting out a request for information on this evening's show. A phone number for the owner or a contact. She'd have somebody to clean the place between visitors and to hold the keys, and a description of our mysterious woman." "We weren't in time to get the dead woman onto yesterday evening's ferry," Sandy said, as if he'd just remembered and this was something Perez should know. "She'll be going south to Aberdeen tonight. James Grieve is ready for her." "It would be good to have a name before James starts the post-mortem," Perez said. "I'd like to tell the relatives what's happening before he begins his work." His phone rang. He was expecting a summons to another meeting, but it was Catherine Rogerson, the young woman who'd recently taken over as the teacher at Ravenswick School. "I'm afraid we're closing the school today, Mr. Perez. The engineers department wants to survey the hill all the way up along to Gillsgarth. It might need shoring up from the road. If there was another landslide there, the school would be right in its path, and we've been advised we have to get all the children away." She still sounded like a child herself, rather earnest and desperate to do the right thing. Perez knew her father, who was a lawyer with an office just off Commercial Street. "I know Maggie Thompson sometimes cares for Cassie when you're at work, but she's away at her sister's and her flight's been cancelled." So now he'd have to start ringing round to sort out childcare, the last thing he needed. Duncan Hunter, Cassie's natural father, was in Spain, apparently making out a deal with a company supplying holiday villas to the rental market. In practice, avoiding the most miserable of Shetland's weather. This was the time of year for islanders who could afford it to take their holidays. "I wonder if you'd like me to bring Cassie back to Lerwick, and she can spend the afternoon with me?" The teacher sounded hesitant, as if the offer might be considered impertinent. "She'd be no bother, and at least you'd know she'd be safe in town. We're nowhere near the danger zone." "Are you sure? It sounds above and beyond the call of duty to act as childminder to your pupils when the school's closed." "Not at all." Perez could picture the teacher in the little office in the school. She was small and tidy and had a pleasant manner with the bairns, but she stood no nonsense. Cassie adored her. "We'll probably be shut at least until after the weekend, so if you need me to have Cassie on any other day, just let me know." "That's very kind. I'll try to sort out something else for later in the week, though." Perez felt uncomfortable, partly because he thought he couldn't take advantage of the woman's good nature, partly because he hated being in emotional debt. He'd never been very good at accepting help. "I'm not sure what time I'll be able to pick Cassie up this evening." "Have supper with us," Catherine said. "My mother always cooks enough for an army." Perez was still trying to think of an excuse that didn't sound rude when the teacher ended the call. Chapter 3. It was the 14th of February. Sandy had a new girlfriend who filled his mind and dulled his concentration. Louisa was a teacher in Yell, a North Isle that was a ferry ride away. He'd known her since they were at school together, but they'd only been going out for a few months and he was still feeling his way. It was midweek, so they hadn't planned to meet to celebrate Valentine's Day, but had decided to get together on Saturday night. Sandy had asked Louisa what she'd like to do, but she hadn't been much help. "Why don't you surprise me, Sandy?" Which seemed like a sort of challenge. He was anxious, and had even begun to hope that the road would still be closed and the dead woman still unidentified, so that he could claim he needed to be at work. Now, he wondered if he should phone her, to show that he'd remembered the date. Or would she think that was soppy? Louisa was the least sentimental woman he'd ever met. He knew she would hate the pink cards he'd seen in the shops, the shiny hearts and the teddy bears, the balloons. He hadn't bought her anything. In the end, he sent her a text. "Thinking of you today. Speak later." Surely she couldn't object to that. On the way to his car, he bumped into Reg Gilbert, who must have been lurking there for most of the day. Reg was the senior reporter on the Shetland Times. He'd previously worked on a big regional daily in the Midlands and had been lured north by a woman who'd immediately dumped him. Now Reg was stranded in the islands, a strange, alien creature, a newshound with virtually nothing of interest to the outside world to report. Except now, when the landslide had become national news. There were dramatic pictures, after all, and Jimmy Perez always said the press loved images more than words. Sandy suspected that Reg had been the writer of some of the more lurid headlines, the ones about the primary school being missed by inches and an island economy devastated by the weather. "Well, Sandy?" The journalist had a nasal voice and a thin, rodent face. His incisors protruded over his bottom lip. "Any closer to finding out who was killed in the mud?" In the past, an innate politeness would have caused Sandy to answer, but he'd been had by Reg once too often, quoted out of context and made to look foolish. He walked past the journalist in silence. It was only mid-afternoon, but Sandy needed his headlights for the drive south. He took the dark winter days in his stride, but he was looking forward to the spring now. He could understand how the long nights turned some incomers a bit mad. He rounded the bend in the road, and suddenly the sight of the landslip was ahead of him, all white lights and black silhouettes. The firefighters had rigged up a generator at Tain, so the ruined house was illuminated. From the road, the scene didn't look like Shetland at all, not the Shetland of hill sheep and peat banks that Sandy had grown up with. This was almost industrial, heavy machinery outlined against the artificial lights, Another generator and more lights showed a team of men starting to clear the debris from the road. The bank would have to be shored up before it could be opened again, but they wouldn't be able to see what was needed until the road was cleared. A lay-by normally used by sightseers looking out to the Isle of Musa had been turned into a car park, and Sandy pulled in there. He put on the Wellingtons and an anorak that he'd stuck in the boot before setting off, and went out to meet the team working on the house. They'd already cleared the track that had led to the croft. Sandy had passed by here on hundreds of occasions, every time he'd gone to pick up a relative from the airport or gone to show visitors the puffins on the cliffs at Sumborough. But he struggled to remember the layout of the land before the slide. He thought a short track had curved down the valley from the main road, and that it had led only to Tain. There'd been a good new road built for the cemetery when it had been extended a few years before, but the entrance to that was further north. And it also led to the Hayes land at Gilsetter, with its bigger house and polytunnels. Where the track ended at Tain, there'd been parking for a couple of cars, and a small garden at the front with a fence around it. It had been possible to see that from the main road. Then, at the back, more land separated by a wall from the rest of the hill, and on each side of the house, a shelter belt of wind-blown sycamores, which seemed to have survived the slide. Sandy shut his eyes for a moment and tried to picture the building. Low, whitewashed and single-story. A traditional croft house from the outside at least. There was no sign of that now. The team had cut a track straight down the hill to where the front door had been. They were dressed in high-vis coats and heavy steel-capped boots, so at first they all looked the same. Sandy stood for a moment, knowing that if he went any closer he'd be in the way. He was often in the way. One of the men caught sight of him and waved him over. "Hello, Sandy. You can come on down. Stay in the middle of the path and you'll be safe enough." He had to shout to make himself heard above the background noise of the generator and a small digger. Tim Barton, a man from the English West Country who'd come to the islands to join the firefighters in Lerwick. Now he was going with a local girl. They'd set up home together at Gilberwick. Sandy thought he'd heard rumours that there was a child on the way. He wondered what that must be like. Since he'd taken up with Louisa, fatherhood had crossed his mind at times. It seemed that he should have been concentrating on where he put his feet, not daydreaming about making a baby with Louisa, because the path was slippery and he slid and fell awkwardly on his back. His coat would be filthy. Barton laughed, but came over and pulled him to his feet. "How's it going?" Sandy nodded towards the house. "No access yet, but it shouldn't be long. We need to know if there's anyone else inside. That's what we all want to know. No chance of finding anyone alive, though. We've been working on this for nearly 24 hours, and from the time we arrived it was clear there couldn't be any survivors." Tim turned and stretched. Sandy saw that his face and hands were streaked black. "You haven't had a break?" Sandy thought that must be some kind of nightmare, working in this mud with the rain still pouring. "A couple of hours to get a shower and a thaw out. Some hot food. But we want to get it done. See what we'll find. If you stay here, I'll let you know when it's clear to get in, or you can wait in the car. At least you'll be dry there." "Nah, I can't get any dirtier." Sandy thought it wouldn't be fair to sit in the warm car while these boys were digging their way into the house. It was only half an hour before Barton came back to where Sandy was standing. "We've made the roof safe and cleared most of the shite out of the rooms. You can come down if you like, though there's not much to see." "Anyone there?" Barton shook his head. "Nothing human. There's the corpse of a cat in what must have been the kitchen." Sandy followed Barton towards the house. The cat seemed odd to him. Visitors to Shetland might bring a dog with them, but he'd never heard of anyone bringing their cat. Did that mean the dead woman had been living here more permanently? He shook his head and thought he was making problems where none existed. Cats sought out food and warmth. It probably belonged to Kevin Hayes' farm and found its way inside. They stood where the front door had once been. The weight of the landslide had ripped the door from its hinges and smashed it to pieces, so it looked like kindling. Half of the roof had been removed by the firefighters, and there was the same persistent drizzle soaking into the body of the building. The floor was still covered in inches of black mud. Not smooth, but littered with rocks as big as a man's fist, mixed with roots and grit. The smell was of damp and decay. Organic. Everything looked strange because of the light on the tower outside throwing odd shadows. Sandy followed Barton inside. The house was very small. A kitchen that had acted as a living room too, a bedroom and a shower room made out of what had probably once been a small second bedroom. There were pieces of furniture that had survived the landslide. A sofa, upturned, had been thrown against one wall, and in the bedroom, swimming in the mud, a gilt-framed mirror was miraculously intact. "We need something to identify the dead woman." Sandy knew that was what Jimmy Perez wanted from him. "The boss needs a name for her." "We'll be finishing here for the day soon," Barton said. "The boys are dead on their feet. We just had to check that there was nobody inside. I'll get them to leave the big light until last, so you can see what you're doing." Sandy thanked him and watched him leave. He wished he had another police officer with him, someone he could share a joke with or a complaint about the conditions. He had never enjoyed being on his own. He started the search by the front door and quartered the floor, as he'd seen Vicky Hewitt, the CSI from Inverness, do. Some of the kitchen units had been ripped off the wall, and there was shattered crockery among the other muck. One cupboard was still standing. He opened it to find baking trays and pans. 2 expensive pans, solid cast iron. Fran had bought some just the same, and Perez had said they'd cost an arm and a leg. So the owner, or the woman in the red dress, had enjoyed cooking. Minnie Lawrenson wouldn't have used pans like that. The shower cubicle had been smashed into small shards of plastic. The water was running from where the shower head had once been. The toilet bowl was covered in mud, but otherwise seemed undamaged. Sandy moved through to the bedroom. There was a bed, but no bedhead. The mattress was filthy, as muddy water had soaked into it as if it was a sponge. This must have been a pleasant room, with a window looking down towards the sea and a tiled grate. The roof was still on here, but the glass had been pushed out and the rain came in that way. Outside it was completely dark now, and the room was lit by a big arc light shining through the gap in the outside wall. His shadow looked weird, long and very sharp, like a cutout in black paper. Each side of the fireplace there were fitted cupboards. In one there were clothes still on their hangers and surprisingly clean. A woman's coat. Sandy wiped the dirt from his fingers before touching it. It was deep blue and very soft. He thought it was expensive, like the pans. 2 pairs of trousers, well tailored, and some blouses, crisply ironed. In the other cupboard there were shells, jerseys neatly folded, a hardback book of the sort that showed you how to live your life, think yourself to a better future, and a wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. His grandmother, Mima, had had a very similar box and had kept her treasures in it. Sandy pulled on blue latex gloves and slid the book into an evidence bag. There might be fingerprints. He took the box from the cupboard, held his breath and opened it. He'd been hoping for a passport, even a birth certificate. From the box came a faint smell of sandalwood. Inside there were 2 photos, one of 2 small children and one of an elderly couple, and a handwritten letter. He thought it might be a love letter because it began, "My dearest Alice." Sandy put the letter back in the box without reading on. He'd never been a curious man, and he was cold and uncomfortable. The damp had seeped through his clothes. He wanted to be dry and warm before investigating further, and he thought Jimmy Perez should be the man to read the letter first. But he was already planning the call he'd make to Perez once he'd dried out and was feeling more human. At least we have a first name for her. Part of a first name. Chapter 4. Perez knocked on the Rogersons' door and waited. If he'd known the people better, he might just have gone in, but perhaps he would have waited all the same. This was the town, and they did things differently here. The house was solid and stone, and could have been in Aberdeen or Edinburgh. It looked out over the play park where the galley had recently been set alight for Uphellia. The curtains were drawn, so he couldn't see inside. He heard footsteps on the other side of the door, and it opened. The young teacher stood there. She'd changed out of her work clothes and looked even younger in jeans and a sweatshirt. She wore no shoes, and her socks were striped pink and blue. "Mr. Perez?" She stood aside to let him in. "Jimmy, please." She gave him a little shy smile. "Cassie's in the kitchen. She's been helping Mum with the cooking." The house seemed very warm to him, coming in out of the chill drizzle. There was a smell of meat and vegetables, plain and no nonsense but comforting. Mince and tatties. Catherine led him to the back of the house. A plump middle-aged woman was stirring a pan at the stove, and Cassie was on a high stool cutting circles out of pastry. She looked up and saw him. "I'm making jam tarts," she said. Then she added, "Do you remember? I used to do this with Mum." He had a flashback so vivid that he could smell the slightly burnt sugar and Fran's perfume, the pervasive background scent of turpentine and paint, because the Ravenswick kitchen had been Fran's studio too. In his mind, that's where they were, in the house overlooking the water where he still lived with Cassie. On impulse, he'd come to call, one of the first social visits to Fran's home. It had been early spring. Fran had looked over to him and smiled towards a younger Cassie who'd been spooning jam into pastry cases. "They'll taste disgusting, but you'll have to eat one." Her voice too low for Cassie to hear. "Otherwise she'll never forgive you." Now in the Rogerson house in Lerwick, Cassie was looking at him, waiting for an answer. "Of course I remember." "You'll have to eat one of those very special tarts," Catherine said, and there was another jolt of memory, because the words were almost the ones Fran had used. "We'll have them instead of pudding after our supper." Perez had his excuse already prepared for making a quick exit before supper, but he heard Fran's voice in his head again, and just nodded. That would be splendid. There were just the four of them for the meal. Tom Rogerson was at an emergency council meeting. The lawyer was a councillor for Shetland Islands Council and a popular politician. The conversation at the table was of the landslide and the inconvenience it had caused. "Such a shame for those folk who lived in the south and can't get to town for their work." Mavis Rogerson was an Orcadian, and her voice rose and fell with an accent that sounded more Welsh than Shetland. "Do you know when the road will be clear, Jimmy?" "They're hoping to get one lane open by late tomorrow morning." Perez had hardly slept the night before, and the warm kitchen and starchy food were making him drowsy. "It'll mean traffic lights and delays for a couple of months, while they work on shoring up the bank, but at least we'll have access to the airport." "I've been told the school will stay shut until the weekend." Catherine was clearing the plates and stacking them on the draining board. "Would you like us to have Cassie tomorrow, Jimmy? Really, it'll be no bother. You can just drop her in on your way to work." If he'd been less tired, Perez would have thought of an alternative. He could see how eager the teacher was to help, and it crossed his mind even then that it might not be kind to encourage her. Then he thought he was probably 15 years older than her, and a bonny lass like Catherine would surely have a boyfriend. He was flattering himself if he believed she had romantic feelings for him. And besides, Cassie was looking at him with eyes as big as a seal pup's, and he still found it hard to refuse her anything she really wanted. "Well," he said, "if you're sure." When they arrived back at the house in Ravenswick, it was Cassie's bedtime. Further south, the men were still working to clear the road, and there was a background rumble of heavy machinery, but Cassie slept much better these days. There were fewer nightmares. Jimmy had made tea and a fire when Sandy phoned. "What have you got for me, Sandy?" "I wondered if I could come round. There's something I'd like you to see." "Why not?" It no longer felt like an intrusion to have colleagues in the house that he'd shared very briefly with Fran. "But tell me, have we got a name for our woman in the red dress?" He wanted a name, a little dignity for her. "One name," Sandy said, "or maybe part of a name." He arrived more quickly than Perez had expected. He must have been ready to leave home just before phoning. There was a gentle tap on the door, and then he came in, carrying a small wooden box and a couple of bottles of Unst beer. Sandy preferred lager himself, but he knew Perez liked white wife. "We're lucky to live north of the landslide," Perez said, "or we'd be stranded too, with no chance to get into town." He knew Sandy didn't like to be rushed into giving information. It took Sandy a little time to get his thoughts in order, so the small talk was about giving him some breathing space. "I went down to Tane earlier," Sandy said. "The boys had cleared it just enough to make it safe to get in." "Did they find anyone inside?" But Perez thought even Sandy would have passed on a fact like that straight away. "Nothing human. The body of a cat." Sandy paused. "And that seemed kind of weird. I mean, if it had been a holiday let." Perez thought that was a sensible query. "We need to find out who's in charge of letting the place. A priority for tomorrow. Maybe they advertise privately through the Promote Shetland or Visit Scotland website. Someone must have a phone number for the owner in the US. A pause. "But you're right. A cat actually inside the house does seem a bit strange." "I think the woman's name is Alice," Sandy said, "spelt with an S. If it is a proper name. I didn't find anything useful like a passport, but there was this." He set the box very carefully on the table, as if it was a valuable gift. "It was inside a cupboard, and it wasn't damaged at all by the landslide." Alice. Surely that was an abbreviation. Perez lifted the lid and took out 2 photographs. The first was of an elderly couple sitting on a white wooden bench in a garden. The bench seemed to stand on sandy soil. The woman wore a flowery summer dress, and the man had a brown face, creased like old leather. She looked rather stern, even hostile, with her feet flat on the ground. His legs were slightly splayed, and he had a wide, gappy smile. Both squinted slightly because they were looking into bright sunshine. "Where do you think that was taken? Somewhere hot, I'd say. Greece? Spain?" Perez hoped it was Spain. He wanted to believe that Alice came from the country of his ancestors. He imagined a landscape that smelled of thyme and olive oil. Sandy shook his head. He didn't know anything about hot countries. How could he, when he'd never lived away from Shetland? "I don't know. It could have been taken in a sunny garden anywhere in the world. The background's all blurry. It could even have been taken in Shetland on a fine day in midsummer." But Perez's imagination had taken him to Spain. "Are they her parents, do you think? They'd be the right sort of age." "Aye, maybe." Sandy drank his beer slowly and watched Perez take the other photo from the box. 2 children aged about 5 and 7, not on the bench, but on swings in a play park. There was the same sandy soil beneath the swing. The girl was the older. She was wearing shorts and a jumper and stared defiantly at the camera. She'd lost almost as many teeth as the old man, but Perez supposed that she'd get new ones. The boy had curly hair and a smile that must have charmed old ladies. "And are these Alice's children?" Now it was clear that Perez was talking to himself, and Sandy made no attempt to answer. Perez turned both pictures so that he could look at the back, hoping for a name or a date, but there was nothing. "So, how did you get a name for her, Sandy?" "From the letter." Sandy nodded back to the box. "I haven't read it at all. I thought I'd wait for you." Perez laid the letter on the table in front of him. There was no address from the sender at the top. The writing was precise and rather formal. He thought it must have been written some time ago. Even older people now used email and texting. Everyone had forgotten the art of writing, and any handwritten notes he received these days were sprawling and untidy. "My dearest Alice, what a joy to know that you'll be back in the islands again after so many years. I've so enjoyed our rare encounters on my visits south, and I know you're the same beautiful woman who first attracted me when we first met. I'm sure we can make a go of things, and that we'll have a wonderful future together." There was no signature at the bottom, just a row of kisses, and Perez wondered what that suggested. Perhaps this was a married man who didn't want to leave any evidence of his adultery. Someone cautious, keeping his options open, despite his promise of a future with the now dead woman. Or perhaps the writer felt that a name was superfluous. Of course, Alice would know the identity of the writer. And this was all you could find? Perez tried to keep his voice free of irritation, but he found these brief glimpses into the woman's life frustrating. He could make up a story about the dark woman, about her parents and her children and the island man who'd fallen for her, but that would be a fiction. He needed something more concrete to help identify her. "There's this book. I thought we might get fingerprints." "Which will only help if she's on our system." "I was very thorough, Jimmy." Sandy had taken the words as criticism, despite Perez's efforts. "Tain is a small house, and there was very little left inside. If we search through the debris in the garden, we might have more success." Perez didn't answer immediately. "Was there any response to the Radio Shetland appeal for information?" "Jane Hay called in," Sandy said. "She thought she might have seen someone of that description in the co-op in Bray a week ago. I was thinking I'd go and see her tomorrow." He paused. "She seems like a sensible woman. I can't see that she'd make up something like that." "No, I'll talk to her." Perez wanted to be the person to breathe life into the dead woman. It was ridiculous, but he couldn't help himself. "I'll call in on my way to work. She's a neighbour. The Hay place is right next to Tain. Kevin said he hadn't seen anyone in the house, but Jane might have done." Sandy stood up, and Perez led him out. Usually it would have been quiet and dark. There were no streetlights here, and Magnus's house was still empty. But further south, the men were working to get the road clear for the following day, and the powerful arc lights threw strange shadows across the hill. Chapter 5. Jane Hay settled on the wooden chair and nodded to the other people in the circle. There were fewer than usual this evening. There must be friends who couldn't get to the meeting because of the landslide. She sipped tea, waited for the latecomers, and was aware of the calm and gratitude that always accompanied her here on meeting nights. The community hall was heated by a Calor gas heater, and the fumes caught in her nostrils and at the back of her throat, but she was so used to them that they had become a part of the experience. Alf Walters spoke a couple of words of welcome, and they started. Jane cleared her throat, and there was a brief moment of tension as she waited for her turn. She'd been coming to meetings for more than 11 years, but she was still a little nervous. "My name's Jane, and I'm an alcoholic." She stayed behind for half an hour afterwards because she was sponsoring a young woman, an emergency doctor based at the Gilbert Bain Hospital, and wanted to see how she was doing. Rachel had been coming to meetings for 3 months, but she was still struggling. After a stressful day at work, her colleagues all turned to a glass of wine to help them relax. For Rachel, 1 glass or 1 bottle would never be enough. She still occasionally phoned Jane in the early hours of the morning, either very drunk or needing support and reassurance. "I'm sorry, I'm such a failure." Jane could tell she was sobbing. Jane understood what she was going through, and was always patient. "You're not a failure at all. This is a disease, and the treatment is brutal. If you were going through chemo for cancer, you wouldn't be so hard on yourself." Kevin was less tolerant of the late-night calls. "Is that one of your alky pals pissed again?" He thought Jane's attendance at meetings was a form of masochistic indulgence. Tonight, he'd had a go at her as she left the house. "You've been sober for years. Since just after the kids started school. Why do you still need all that nonsense? It's not so convenient you disappearing up to town 2 nights a week, and I'll be worried about you being out on a night like this." Usually, she let it go. She couldn't change him, just as he couldn't change her, But she'd been tense all day. The rain and the background noise of the machinery at the landslide had stretched her nerves. The boys had been moody too, sniping at each other over the supper table, answering their parents in monosyllabic grunts. They were such different characters that usually they got on fine. But that evening, she'd sensed an underlying animosity between them, something bitter and brooding. She'd felt the stress as a tightness in her arms and spine, in the twitch of a nerve in her face. "Would you rather I was drinking?" They'd been on their own in the kitchen. The boys had disappeared to their rooms to relieve their own tension by killing people on separate computer screens, or so she supposed. She'd felt herself trembling, could hear the shrill voice that was almost out of control. "You'd rather I was disappearing off into the night and coming back bladdered in a taxi in the early hours of the morning, not knowing where I'd been, not being able to care for the bairns in a total mess." He'd stared at her without speaking for a moment. "You know what?" He turned away to look out of the window into the dark so she couldn't see his face. "You were a lot more fun in those days. At least we could have a bit of a laugh." He turned back to the room quickly to hug her and apologize, but she'd heard the wistfulness in his voice. She'd told herself then that the outburst was to do with Kevin feeling middle-aged. He was looking back to his youth with nostalgia. Now, driving back towards the farm, she wasn't so sure. For the first time in years, she felt the compulsion to drink. Tesco's was still open. She could buy a bottle of wine and sit in the furthest corner of the car park where nobody would see her. If it had a screw top, she'd have no problem opening it. She imagined the sensation of the alcohol in her bloodstream. It would relax her. The tension in her back would disappear. The jangling nerves would quieten. She wouldn't need to drink at all, just enough to make her forget the anxieties of the day. She would drive home, be more pleasant to Kevin and the boys, and she would sleep more easily than she had for weeks. Nobody need ever know. At the roundabout on the edge of Lerwick, she signalled to turn into the supermarket car park, and then at the last minute changed her mind, causing the taxi driver behind her to hit his horn and mouth obscenities about women drivers. She took no notice and continued on the road south, towards Gilsiter. Kevin was waiting for her. He lit the wood burner and some candles. There was the smell of real coffee, beeswax and peat. "What's this all about?" She was shaking off her coat, pulling off her boots at the living-room door. This was her favourite room in the house, but they spent most of their time in the kitchen. He'd been sitting in front of the television, but zapped it off when he stood up to greet her. She thought he'd been dozing. He had that tousled little boy look that he had when he first woke up. "It's Valentine's Day. I thought I'd remember it for once." She walked towards him and was aware of the contrast of polished floorboards and sheepskin rugs on her bare feet. "And I'm sorry about earlier," he said. "That was just crass. I don't know why I said it. Frustrated about the weather, maybe, and needing someone to blame." He was going to say more. Jane knew what it would be, how he couldn't manage without her, the sort of things you might say to a housekeeper or a mother, though with a little less emotion. She put a finger to his lips to stop him talking and took him into her arms. Jane had just got the boys out to the bus the next day when Jimmy Perez arrived. She'd waved her sons out of the house just as she had done when they were tiny. Andy had left school the year before, but he still went into town each day. He'd started at university in Glasgow on an English course. She'd thought he'd adore it. He was the sparky one, always full of adventure, telling her about his reading, the films that he'd watched. But when he'd arrived back at Christmas, he'd announced that he wouldn't be going back. No reason given, and not open to persuasion. He'd found a job in the bar in the Mareel Arts Centre in Lerwick, and it seemed to suit him. He was working with other arty young people, and he didn't mind doing the late shift, if there was music. Michael, the younger son, had never had ambitions to leave the island. He was doing his hires, but they all thought he'd join the family business when school was over. They'd always known he was more practical than academic, and besides he had Gemma to hold him here. They'd been seeing each other since they were 15, and they already seemed like a settled married couple. Jane thought it might not be too long before she became a grandmother. So when Jimmy Perez arrived, the house was quiet. Kevin had been out for a while, contracted by the council to work on clearing the road. He was happy. He'd felt he'd put things right between them, and he hated an atmosphere. Watching through the kitchen window, Jane saw that the inspector had his small daughter with him. "Sorry about this." Perez nodded towards the child. "The school's closed until after the weekend. Catherine Rogerson's offered to mind her, but I thought I'd come here before heading off to Lerwick." "Have you time for a coffee?" She was pleased that she'd already loaded the dishwasher with the breakfast plates. Jane hated mess. She was proud of this house. When she'd first moved here with Kevin soon after their marriage, his parents had only recently moved out to a modern bungalow in town. The farmhouse had been modernised by Kevin's father in the early 70s and not touched again until Kevin and Jane moved in. It had had loud orange wallpaper and clashing carpets, both mostly hidden by mounds of clutter. She and Kevin had extended it, and Jane had designed it to her taste. "Why not?" Perez smiled at her, and she thought how handsome he was, dark like a storybook pirate. She found crayons and paper for Cassie and sat her at the table. "What can I do for you, Jimmy?" "We're trying to identify the woman who was living in Tain, the one who was killed in the landslide. You phoned in to say you might have seen her." "Yes." Jane had called the police station on impulse when she'd heard the description on Radio Shetland before going out to her meeting. Kevin had come into the kitchen while she was making the call, and when she'd described the woman she'd seen, he'd frowned. "I was with Jimmy at Tain yesterday," he'd said. "You didn't say." It had seemed such a huge thing to have seen a dead woman thrown up by the tide of mud like flotsam on a beach. She couldn't believe that Kevin hadn't told her. "I walked away before he found her," he'd continued. "I didn't know anything about it until the ambulance turned up. I helped clear a way for them. Besides, it's not something you'd want to remember." Looking back, it seemed that their argument of the night before had started there, with Kevin brooding about the imagined picture of a dead woman, holding it to himself as if it was something he couldn't bear to share. Now she saw that Jimmy Perez was waiting for her to describe her meeting with the strange woman, and she tried to remember the encounter in detail. "I was in Bray," she said. "I was up there chatting to Ingrid Johnson. I'm hoping she'll help me out with the business this year. They have a couple of polytunnels too. She might grow some stuff for me. I'm running out of space." Jimmy nodded. "How's the business doing?" "Really well." Once the boys were at school, Jane had developed her own enterprise on the croft. She grew herbs, fruit and salads under polythene, and after a slow start, things were going well. She supplied most of the hotels and restaurants in the islands, and had been approached about exporting her products to mainland Scotland and beyond. Now she had 3 giant polycrubs on the land closest to the house. She'd chosen a sheltered position for them, but even so, at this time of year, Kevin helped her to cover them with fishing nets, pegged into the earth to stop the tunnels from blowing away. Jane returned to her story. "I stopped off at the co-op just to pick up a couple of things for my lunch, and I saw the dead woman there. I'm sure it was her. She was buying champagne." She still noticed what people bought to drink. That never left her. She paused, distracted by a sudden thought. If she lived in Tain, why would she be all the way north in Bray doing her shopping? There'd be more choice in Lerwick, and it'd be much closer to go there. "Can you describe her?" Perez's voice was quiet. At the other end of the table, Cassie didn't seem to have heard him speaking. "She was very dark and exotic," Jane said, "with beautiful black hair." "Age?" He looked up from his coffee. "Not young. Late 30s, maybe. 40s, and well preserved. No grey in the hair, but that doesn't mean anything these days, when we can get it in a bottle." "Did you hear her speak? It would be helpful if we had some idea of her accent." Again, Jane tried to imagine herself back in the shop in Bray. It had been busy, 2 tills open, She'd been standing next to the woman in a different queue, squinting across because she was curious about her. "Not Shetland," she said now to Perez. The woman hadn't said much to the guy in the till, but there'd been an exchange about the champagne. He'd asked if she was celebrating. "English?" "Maybe. She didn't have a strong accent, but I'd say she was from the south." Jane paused. "I couldn't swear to anything, though. She only said a few words, and there was a lot of background noise. She could have come from anywhere in the world." Almost repeating Sandy's comment about the photo the night before. "Did she pay by cash or credit card?" Perez's voice was measured, but she could tell this mattered. Jane shook her head. "I'm sorry. I was paying then myself. I didn't notice." "Did you see where she went when she left the shop?" Jane replayed the events in her head again. There'd been a sudden downpour, the rain dramatic after a morning of persistent drizzle. She had stood in the entrance of the shop, hoping it would pass. She'd only walked from the shop's car park, but she would be drenched in the time it would take to run back to her vehicle. Had the dark woman been there too? There was a car waiting for her. She saw it very clearly, a car driving up almost to the door of the shop, and the dark woman politely pushing her way through the other waiting customers, then running through the downpour to climb into the vehicle. Someone else was driving. Perez had started making notes. He looked up. "Oh, yes. She got in the passenger door. The rest of us were jealous. We knew we'd get wet, even running to the car park." "Did you see the driver at all?" Jane shook her head. "He was furthest away from us. He'd driven, so the passenger door was closest to the shop." "But you think it was a he?" "I'm not sure," she said. "Perhaps I just made that assumption, because of the champagne, because it was running up to Valentine's Day." Jimmy Perez smiled to show he understood the way her mind had been working. "Can you tell me anything about the car?" He set down his pen and gave her his full attention. She shut her eyes for a moment in the hope of fixing the image. "Dark," she said. "A medium-sized family saloon, but the rain was so fierce, Jimmy, and the light was so bad that any colour seemed washed away. And I couldn't tell you the make. I'm not interested in cars. I couldn't even start to think about the registration number." "I didn't expect that for a minute," he grinned, but she could tell he was disappointed. "It had a Shetland flag stuck on the back bumper." The memory shot into her mind. The white cross against the blue was caught in the light from the store, and seemed bright in the gloom, and I thought it was odd because I'd decided the woman wasn't local. She was rewarded by a sudden smile that lit up his face. She remembered Jimmy smiling a lot like that when Fran was alive. It was as if the artist had given him permission to be silly. More recently, he'd become grave and responsible again. "Had you seen her round here?" Perez looked up from his coffee. "You'd have been her nearest neighbour. Perhaps you noticed the same car at the house." "No," she said. "Not a car. And you can't quite see Tane from here. It's hidden in that dip in the hill and by the trees." She paused and tried to remember. "I saw lights in there one day. I'd been out for a walk to the shore and took a shortcut back to the house." "When was that?" "About a month ago, between Hogmanay and Uphellia." She pictured the scene. It had been about 4 o'clock and already dark. She'd been hurrying back because it was a meeting night, and she'd wanted to start cooking tea so that she could get into Lerwick on time. Then she'd seen the lights spilling out from the croft. She'd been grateful to have the path lit up, but embarrassed too because she'd been in effect walking through someone else's garden. "Did you see anyone inside?" "Yes." She'd hurried past the window, hoping the person inside wouldn't turn round. "A woman." "Could it have been the woman you saw in Bray?" Jane nodded. "She had dark hair, certainly. Long dark hair. I only saw her back, not her face." She was about to continue, but really, what else was there to say? "That's very helpful," he said. "Really, thanks. And for the only decent cup of coffee I'll get all day." She walked with him and Cassie out into the yard. She was brooding about the woman in Tain. Then her mind switched direction and she thought Jimmy Perez would make a fine husband for someone one day. Chapter 6. Back in his office, Jimmy Perez phoned the co-op in Bray and asked to talk to the manager. "I'm interested in a purchase made a couple of days ago. February the 12th, a bottle of champagne." "Maui and Shandong was on special offer." A pause. "Along with our own brand chocolate. It was the run-up to Valentine's Day." "Yes, I know." Perez was thinking back to his first Valentine's Day with Fran. He'd invited her to his house on the water in Lerwick and cooked for her. Nothing special, but he could remember every mouthful. He'd used some of the Fair Isle shoulder of lamb he had left in the freezer and made a Moroccan dish with dried apricots. He'd found the recipe online and followed it slavishly. They talked about how they might go to North Africa one day, had daydreamed about spice markets, as the Bressay ferry crisscrossed the Sound outside the window. Flashes of memory like that weren't as painful as they'd once been, but they still unnerved him, threw him off track. "We sold a fair few bottles." The manager's voice was English and broke into the daydream. "I'm not sure my staff would remember every purchase." "Would you be able to check a credit card sale if I gave you an approximate time? I'd like the name of the card holder." "That should be possible. It might take a while, though." The manager sounded less enthusiastic about the effort it would take to trace the sale. "Can I call you back?" "I'll send someone up to talk to your staff," Perez said. "They'll be there in an hour. It would be good if you could have the information ready by then." He couldn't help being sharp. James Grieve would have started the post-mortem by now. He'd promised to do it as soon as the body arrived in Aberdeen from the boat. Perez hated the idea of his dark-eyed lady being cut open as an anonymous corpse. Sandy stuck his head round the door. "I'm still trying to track down a contact for the owner of Tain. The landslide's been all over the national news, and you'd think they'd get in touch, just to start things moving with their insurers." "No joy." "I've talked to Stuart Henderson. His son Craig leased it for 6 months last year. Craig's in the oil business, and he's on contract in the UAE. But his time is up. He's travelling back just now, and he'll be home at the weekend. At least we'll have a contact then. The lettings all seem to have been done on a private basis. I haven't seen the house advertised anywhere, either through the estate agents or as a holiday let. Promote Shetland didn't know anything about it." Sandy moved into the room and landed on the other side of Perez's desk. "Was Jane Hay any help?" "Jane saw a woman in Bray Co-op the day before the landslide. Lunchtime. Her description matches our Alice. Go up and chat to the staff, Sandy, and see if she's a regular. That might mean she was working in North Mainland, at Salamvo maybe, or one of the hotels there. She wasn't on her own. A guy picked her up in a car, a local car with a Shetland flag on the bumper. Jane saw her buying a bottle of champagne. I've asked the manager to check credit card sales for the day to see if we can confirm a name." Sandy had just left the office when the phone rang again. "Jimmy!" James Grieve had worked in Aberdeen for years, but hadn't lost his West Coast accent. "We might have a bit of a problem." "What sort of problem?" Perez was still worrying over identification. He was thinking of the children in the photo, who might be older now but had probably lost a mother and needed to be told, and of elderly parents who'd lost a child without knowing. "Your woman didn't die by accident. The knocks to the head and the contusions on the face happened post-mortem. If she didn't die in the landslide, what killed her?" Perez wondered why he wasn't more surprised. The strangeness of her dress, perhaps, the exotic look that was so out of place in Shetland. It seemed fitting that her death should be dramatic too. He was imagining a grand, almost operatic suicide. "She was strangled. The ligature mark was hidden by the damage caused by the slide." "She didn't hang herself?" The melodramatic gesture of suicide had remained with him. "No." The retort was furious and explosive. "I didn't see any petecae." Perez remembered the dark, staring eyes. He hadn't noticed any burst blood vessels. "No. Well, maybe the light wasn't so great when you saw her, and there was a lot of muck over her face. You're not questioning my judgment, I hope, Inspector." His voice was faintly mocking, but the tone was firm enough for Perez to realise he was on dangerous ground. James Grieve was good at his job, and knew it. He was accustomed to having his opinions accepted immediately. Perez tried to think back to his first sight of the dead woman, thrown up against the wall at Tain. The professor was right. It had been raining so hard that the visibility had been atrocious. Was the image he carried round in his head a fiction? Idealized? Had he become obsessed by the victim just because he hadn't seen her clearly? "What else can you tell me?" "The ligature was narrow and hard. A leather belt, perhaps. That sort of width. Though no signs of a buckle mark. There were some indentations, maybe the belt was embossed. You might find a match." The pathologist paused. "Her clothes have gone for analysis. It'll be pretty near impossible to separate the filth from the landslide from anything that might have been there previously. The same for under her fingernails, I'd have thought, though there might be scraps of skin beneath the mud. Possibly her own skin, if she was trying to pull the ligature away from her neck." "Any idea what time she was killed? It'd be useful to know how long she'd been dead before the landslide hit the house." "You are joking, I hope." James Grieve was always scathing about colleagues who claimed any sort of accuracy around time of death. "It was almost 2 days before I saw her, Jimmy, and it would have been impossible even if I'd been called straight to the scene." Jane Hay claimed to have seen the woman in Bray at lunchtime on the 12th. If that information was right, she must have been killed between then and the landslide on the afternoon of the 13th. Not such a long gap. "We still don't have a definitive ID," Perez said. "Anything you can give me to help with that?" "She's had some dental work done, but nothing recent. If she's just moved to Shetland or she's a visitor, that's not a lot of use to you. She's never had a child." So who were the children in the photo? The boy and the girl. The girl older, with a mind of her own, the boy a charmer. Perez looked at the image he'd pinned to the board in his office. At the end of the line, the pathologist was still talking. "Her last meal was lamb, stewed with spices. Couscous." With a jolt, Perez remembered again the meal he'd cooked for Fran on Valentine's Day. The odd synergy between him and the murdered woman was unsettling him. He tried to push her image from his mind, to concentrate on the matter in hand and stay detached. "Alcohol?" "Not enough to be significant." So why had she been buying champagne, if the woman in Bray was indeed the murder victim? "I'll get a full report to you this afternoon," the professor said. "You'll want to get started on the investigation, I expect. Let Inverness know, so they can get their finest onto a plane. There's not much of the crime scene left for the CSI to work on. The firefighters had to clear it to check there hadn't been other fatalities." But Perez was already thinking of another woman, Chief Inspector Willow Reeves, who was as different from the victim as it was possible to be. Strong as a Viking with wild, tangled hair, a vegetarian who'd never eat lamb, even with cumin and couscous. Brought up in a commune in the Western Isles, she'd seen joining the police as a form of rebellion, but she still practiced yoga every morning. Like the dark-eyed victim at Tain, Willow troubled and distracted him. All the same, she was the first person he phoned when he ended his call to James Grieve. She sounded distant and a little bored when she answered. "Reeves, Serious Crime Squad." "Willow, it's Jimmy Perez." There was a pause. He didn't know what to make of that. Was she pleased to hear from him? Irritated? "Jimmy, how can I help you?" Colleague to colleague, friendly but very professional. He explained the situation. "We assumed it was an accidental death. Nothing to suggest otherwise at the time, though maybe I should have picked up the petecae. You're a detective, not a scientist, and in those conditions I doubt the professor would have done any better." He found himself smiling. Willow always managed to make him feel better about himself. "You know the patch now. I was hoping you might take it on as SIO, if you're not tied up with anything important." Another pause. He wondered if he'd said the wrong thing. if he should have made a more formal request or made it clear that he valued her competence as well as her experience in the islands. He hated to think he might have offended her. He held his breath and realised how much he wanted Willow Reeves to be in Shetland with him. He couldn't imagine running the investigation with any other officer. "Just you try and stop me, Jimmy Perez." Suddenly, she sounded like a child offered a day off from school. "I'll be on the first plane north." "No." He had to speak quickly before she replaced the receiver. "Wait until tomorrow. At least one lane of the road north from Sumborough should be cleared by then. Just now all the flights are coming into Skatsta, and there are terrible delays. If you want to get started on the case, we still haven't identified the victim. There was a letter in the house addressed to an Alice, A-L-I-S, an unusual name. Obviously an abbreviation. Maybe you could get your people onto the ferry company and the airline, see if that fits with any of their passengers. It would be terrific if we could find a surname for her. I'm assuming she's an outsider and travelled up relatively recently. All my officers are tied up here in the aftermath of the disaster. There are still people cut off, no electricity, and that sort of inquiry takes time." He realised that sounded like an excuse for his own inaction. Again, he wondered if he'd overstepped the mark. It wasn't his place to tell a superior officer from the mainland what to do. "Of course, Jimmy. I'll get a couple of my team onto it. Anything else you'd like me to do while I'm idling my time here at HQ?" He knew she was teasing him. "Could you see if Vicky Hewitt is free to come up with you? It's a nightmare of a scene. The landslide went straight through the house, and then they had to bring in heavy machinery to clear a path and dig out a lot of the interior. And it's still raining. But I'd like her to look at it. At the interior of the house and at the debris trapped behind the wall where we found the body." "Can you email me photos, Jimmy?" She was in work mode now, efficient, buzzing with energy. "And anything else that you have." "Book yourself onto the first plane into Sumborough tomorrow," he said. "I'll be at the airport to meet you. I'll pack a bottle of that island malt you like." She paused for a moment. "Anything else I can fetch you from the civilized world?" He almost said something soppy. "Just you. That'll be enough for me." But he caught himself just in time. "Aye," he said, "a change in the weather, before the whole island washes away." Chapter 7. Perez phoned just as Sandy was pulling into the car park to the side of the Bray Co-op. The children in the school across the road were on their mid-morning break, and although there was still a bit of drizzle, they were out in the yard, chasing and shouting. The worst of the rain had stopped, and Sandy thought they were like cows let out after being in all winter, frisky and a bit mad. "The woman's death wasn't an accident," Perez said. "She was already dead before the landslide happened. James Grieve has it down as murder." Sandy took a while to make sense of that. "But the killer couldn't have known about the landslip." "Of course not." Sandy could tell that Perez was using his patient voice. People in authority, those who knew him well, had been using the same tone to Sandy since he was a boy. It wasn't that he was stupid, but they realised he needed to think things through in his own time. "Perhaps the killer planned to dispose of the body and the landslide got in the way, or perhaps the woman was left at Tain. It seems as if there were no regular visitors and the murderer could have been away from the islands before she was discovered. We don't even know for certain that she was killed at the house." Perez paused. "But this is a murder investigation now, Sandy. It's even more urgent that we identify the victim. So be thorough, and don't take any crap from the manager. Come back with a name for me." No pressure, then. The school bell rang as Sandy got out of the car, and the pupils ran inside. The shop was large and well-stocked. It served the whole of North Mainland. A big new hotel had been built for oilies just down the road, and Sandy assumed that would be good for business too. A couple of women were walking down the aisles, and a young man stood behind the till, with the bottles of more expensive wine and spirits on a shelf behind him. He was reading a magazine that he was hiding under the counter, and had the look of someone who was counting the minutes until a colleague took over at lunchtime. Sandy didn't recognise him. "Where's the manager?" The boy looked up. The shape of his nose was hidden by an explosion of acne. He seemed suddenly more interested in the world around him.
"Are you the police? Colin said you'd be coming."
"Colin?"
"The manager, Colin Sandford."
Sandy did recognise that name. He'd played five-a-side football with Colin for a few seasons, until work had got in the way, or it had seemed too much effort to go out in the evening. "Can I speak to him?" The boy pressed a button and spoke into a microphone.
"This is a staff announcement, Mr. Sandford to the tills, please."
The message echoed through the store, and the assistant beamed. Hearing his own voice was the most excitement he got in his working day. Sandy was led to a glorified cupboard that Colin called his office. It had his name on the door and piles of toilet rolls under the desk. "Have you tracked down a credit card purchase for the 12th? We think it would have been about midday, but my boss wanted you to check an hour either side just to be sure." Sandy had never taken to Colin. He was one of those English men who considered himself superior to the islanders and talked at length about what he was missing out on by being there. His partner had come to work at Sullom Voe, and Colin had followed. In the south, he'd worked in a flashy car showroom, and he usually managed to squeeze into the conversation the fact that he'd been Salesman of the Year 3 times running, and that he'd had a company beamer. "I have checked." Colin smirked. He'd had the same expression every time he'd scored a goal in the Clickamin Leisure Centre, turning round as if he expected applause from a non-existent crowd. The only credit card use within 2 hours was for multiple purchases. He paused, and as Sandy was about to ask another question, he added, "None of the customers bought any champagne. It must have been a cash purchase." "Were you on duty that day?" "Yes, but I wasn't on the shop floor all the time." "Hiding out in here, while your minions did all the work. Did you see this woman?" Perez had got an artist friend of Fran's to do a drawing from the photograph they'd taken of the dead woman's face. No gashes or broken skin. The original drawing had sat on Perez's desk after they'd scanned and printed out copies. Sandy had caught the inspector brooding over it. Colin stared at the picture. "Is she foreign?" "We don't know. We haven't got an identification for her yet. We get some foreign workers in here. They work at the new hotel as chambermaids or waitresses." He sniffed. "It's hard to tell them apart." "We think she lived in Ravenswick," Sandy said. "She was swept out of her house by the landslide." "I don't recognise her." Colin was prepared to be definite now. "Was that lad on the till here on Tuesday?" "Peter? Yes. But you won't get much sense out of him. He's thick as mince." "Can you take over from him, so I can chat properly?" Sandy hoped there'd be a sudden rush of demanding customers as soon as Colin got behind the counter. "I don't do the tills unless there's an emergency. Caroline's stocking up. I'll get her out front. You can talk to Peter in the staff room." The staff room was a slightly bigger cupboard with a formica table, a kettle, an ancient and very grubby microwave, and a small fridge. They were still surrounded by towers of toilet rolls and tins of soup. Peter had become a cocktail of anxiety and excitement. Sandy thought he'd probably watched too many US crime shows.
"What am I supposed to have done?"
"Nothing at all." Sandy nodded towards the kettle. "Any chance of a coffee? I bet you could do with one too."
"My break isn't for another 40 minutes. The boss will be expecting me back."
"Well, this is police business, and it might take a while. I won't tell him about the coffee if you don't." Peter switched on the kettle and pulled a jar of instant coffee from a cupboard. He spooned it into stained mugs. He seemed happier moving. Sandy wiped the table with a tea towel before putting the drawing of the dead woman in front of the man. "We think she was in here on Tuesday. Do you recognise her?"
"What's she done?"
Peter's eyes flicked around the room. He seemed very twitchy. It occurred to Sandy that he might be into drugs, or perhaps he was just desperate for a cigarette. "She's dead," Sandy said. "We found her body after the landslide on Wednesday night, but we don't know who she is. We need to track down her relatives." Peter stared at her.
"Aye, she was in. She bought a bottle of champagne."
"Anything else?" The boy screwed up his eyes, a pantomime of thinking.
"A packet of couscous."
You can remember that, after all the customers you serve. Sandy was all admiration. He knew how little praise it took for an insecure person to feel grateful.
Aye, well, I've always had a good memory. Besides, she was striking, you ken, with that long black hair.
He blushed.
I mean, she was old enough to be my mother, but it still made me feel good just looking at her.
Did you chat at all?
Not really. There was a queue behind her, just while I was ringing up the items. I asked her if the champagne was for Valentine's Day, and I said her man should be buying it for her.
He blushed again.
Soppy, huh? But the boss says we should engage with the customers.
What did she say? Sandy thought how lucky he was that he didn't have a boss like Colin.
She said she didn't need a special occasion to drink champagne.
Accent?
Not local, but I didn't notice, not really.
I can tell you're more a visual person. Sandy turned on the flattery again. Can you tell me what she was wearing? Peter screwed up his face again, but it seemed he did have a visual memory.
A coat, long and dark blue and reaching almost to her ankles, kind of stylish like you might wear in the city. Not waterproof like most of the women here would wear, black boots with a narrow heel, a blue silk scarf.
So, office clothes?
Smart, yeah.
I couldn't see what she was wearing underneath the coat. He blushed again. Sandy was thinking that he'd seen a coat like that in the cupboard at Tain, another confirmation that they had found the right woman.
Had you seen her before?
I mean, is she a regular customer?
No, not regular. I've seen it before, though.
Peter had reached into a drawer for a packet of biscuits and dunked one into his coffee. It fell apart before he could get it into his mouth, and soggy crumbs fell back into the mug. He swore under his breath. In the shop?
Nah, in Lerwick. In the bar in Mareel, upstairs. I was waiting to see a film.
When was this? Sandy sipped the coffee as if he had all the time in the world.
A week ago, the Friday night. I was going to meet some friends, got there a bit early. Perhaps that's why I noticed her when she came into the shop the other day. I knew I'd seen her before.
Was she on her own?
No, she was with a bloke, Peter said. Smart, jacket and tie, not a suit, but he'd made an effort.
You didn't know him? Because Sandy thought the boy would have blotted out a name if he'd had one. He'd want to show off. Peter shook his head.
He was older, you know. He wasn't someone I'd have gone to school with. Anything else that might help us trace him? Sorry.
Outside, the rain had stopped and a faint milky sunlight filtered through the gloom. Instead of turning back towards Lerwick, Sandy headed towards Sullom Voe and stopped at the new hotel that had been built just outside the village of Bray. Its accommodation was used solely for oil, gas and construction workers, and had been full since it had been slotted together like a giant bit of Lego several years before. Sandy had been inside once for the Sunday lunch carvery. It had felt a bit like going abroad and wandering into another world. There were foreign voices, loud and confident, and even those who spoke English were sharing jokes he couldn't understand. Now reception was crowded with men waiting to check out. They stood with their holdalls at their feet, impatient. Sandy supposed they'd been stranded because of the restricted flights and were anxious to get home. He waited until the queue had cleared, and then went up to the desk. "Did you know this woman?" Sandy thought he saw a spark of recognition, but the receptionist shook his head. "Sorry. She doesn't work here." "No, I'm certain about that." The man had an accent, too. Sandy thought it was probably Eastern European, but his English was just as good as Sandy's. "You know all the staff?" The receptionist nodded. "Most of us live in. Those who aren't Shetlanders, and she doesn't look like a local. So if she worked here, I would recognize her." "You've never seen her as a guest in the bar or the restaurant?" This time there was a brief hesitation. "I don't think so. She's not a regular, but lots of people wander through and I'm stuck on the desk." "She's kind of striking," Sandy said. "I think you'd notice." Another pause. "Sorry, I really don't think I can help."
The queue had built up behind Sandy again. He could hear muttered comments and felt intimidated by the oil men's bulk and hostility. He nodded to the receptionist and walked outside. The cloud had lifted even further, so now he could see down the Vaud towards the terminal. He thought he'd achieved very little. He had one snippet of fresh information from Peter, that the woman had been in the bar in Marille a week ago with a smartly dressed man, but they still had no clue what she was doing in Shetland, and they still had no name for her. Sandy knew that Jimmy Perez would be disappointed in him. Chapter 8. Jane Hay let herself into the largest of the polytunnels, and the familiar smell of compost and vegetation made her feel she was coming home. She'd met Kevin at college in Aberdeen. He'd been doing agriculture, but her subject was horticulture. On their first date, he'd taken her hands in his and laughed at the ingrained soil under her thumbnail. Later, he'd told her he knew then that she was the girl for him. Her parents had grown soft fruit, and the plan had always been that she would join the family business once she'd graduated. Her father had been more addicted to drinking than horticulture, even before Jane started at college, and she'd seen herself in the role of saviour. She'd dreamed of returning home with the knowledge and the passion to take on the company and make it profitable again. But her father had died suddenly, when his liver gave up its unequal struggle with the booze, and her mother had sold up immediately without consulting Jane about her plans. That had been the start of Jane's strange relationship with alcohol. It had covered up her sadness and made her fun to be with. Later it became her secret consolation. Now she prepared the soil in the polytunnel and thought her father had at least given her this: the ability to work magic with seeds and earth, an understanding of what made things grow. She was planting early potatoes and carrots for family use. When the rest of Shetland was still dark and grey, in her polythene world spring would have arrived. The boys had preferred frozen chips and baked beans when they were young, but she'd always felt a thrill when she put the first new potatoes on the table. It was warm in the strange plastic bubble, and she took off her sweater. Outside, drizzle ran in streaks down the tunnel, clouding the polythene so that she had no sense of the outside world. And all the time, she was thinking about the dark-haired woman who'd stayed in Tain. She hadn't been entirely honest when she'd spoken to Jimmy Perez that morning. It wasn't that she'd lied. Lies had come easily to her when she'd been drinking. That was something all alcoholics had in common. They lied to their friends and their families and themselves. They lived in a strange fantasy world of obsession and escape. She tried to be honest these days, though sometimes it was hard with Kevin, who needed more reassurance than her sons did. "Of course I love you. I couldn't live without you. Of course I'm happy with what we have." Now she wondered if that was the truth. When the hill had slipped, fracturing their land and cutting it in two, it seemed that her image of herself as wife and mother had shattered too. She began to consider a parallel life away from the islands. How would she have ended up if she hadn't met Kevin? If he hadn't fallen wildly in love with a lass from Perth with soil under her thumbnail? She'd known from the beginning that there was no question of him staying in the Scottish mainland with her. He might love her, but not enough to give up the family croft. Would she have become an alcoholic if things had been different? She pushed that thought away quickly. There was nobody to blame for her drinking, not even her father, who'd been as much a victim of the illness as she had been. As she frequently told Rachel, alcoholism was a disease and not a lifestyle choice. But although she hadn't lied to Jimmy Perez, she hadn't told him the whole story. That afternoon, when she'd hurried back from the shore in the dark and seen the woman in Tain, her silhouette against the light, there had been somebody else in the house with the stranger. Jane had seen a shadow on the wall behind the woman, impossible to make out who was there, and, besides, it had only been a glimpse. She could have been mistaken. But later, from her own kitchen window, she'd seen a torchlight moving up the path between Tain and their house through the sycamores, and soon afterwards Kevin had come in, his hair damp from the drizzle, looking a little confused and strange. Where have you been?"
"Just to the shed," he'd said, "to check on the cows." But Tane was in quite the other direction from the cowshed, and who else would be walking up the path with a torch in his hand? The boys had been around, but they weren't given to wandering about outside in the rain. Now, straightening to fetch water from the butt outside, she couldn't believe that she hadn't demanded an explanation. "But you just walked up from Tane. I saw your torch. What were you doing with the dark-haired woman?" She'd developed the habit of being passive and apologetic, she decided. Once she'd been passionate about all kinds of things, not just her work, about books and music. She still talked about those with her friend Simon. Once she'd been passionate about Kevin. Now, perhaps, she just didn't care enough to make a fuss. When she finished planting, she left the polycrub reluctantly. She'd arranged to meet Simon for lunch and went into the house to shower and change. She had books to return to the library, so she went into town early. Standing at the counter in the converted church that was Lerwick Library, she was aware that the talk all around her was of the results of the landslide. She learned that the road to the airport had opened, but there was still chaos because only one lane was clear and a big section was controlled by traffic lights. Flights were coming into Sumborough again. She waved to people she knew but didn't stop to chat. There was a new cafe right on the shore, near the supermarket where she'd been tempted to stop for wine the night before. Simon Agnew was already sitting at the table near the window, and she felt happier just seeing him. He could always make her laugh, and somehow he understood her in a way that her Shetland pals didn't. They were unlikely friends. He was old enough to be her father, white-haired, lanky. Jane had worked out, from the things he'd let drop, that he must be in his late 60s at least, but he didn't seem at all elderly. A life of sport, adventure and exploration had left him with no spare flesh at all. She thought he was all muscle and sinew and movement. Even now, reading a book at the table, Simon couldn't keep still. He stretched his legs into the aisle, ready to trip up any unsuspecting waitress. He didn't wear specs, and she wondered occasionally if his eyes were so blue because he wore contacts. He was vain enough. He looked up, saw Jane, waved and jumped to his feet. He had more energy than anyone else she knew. He'd moved to Shetland and into the old manse in Ravenswick when he'd retired from his work at a university in the south. Looking for peace, he'd said, though from the beginning there had been nothing peaceful about him. He was restless, still looking for excitement and new projects. He'd blown into Ravenswick like a storm and stirred the settlement into action, bringing them together for meals at the manse, a book group, a community choir. He was into wild swimming and had them all out on the beach early one midsummer's morning, skinny dipping for charity, even Jimmy Perez's Fran. They had found out more about him over time. He'd trained as a psychologist and worked in a busy hospital before becoming an academic. His holidays were spent trekking to little-known corners of the world. He still wrote books, and his house was full of them. There'd been a wife, but he'd divorced years ago. Can't blame her, poor woman. I wasn't at all what she needed. No kids, which was a shame, because he was great with Andy and Michael. Even Kevin liked him, and didn't see Simon as any sort of threat, because although Jane enjoyed Simon's company immensely, she didn't fancy him in the slightest, and Kevin knew her well enough to see that. Now Jane waved back and approached him, her face thrust forward and tilted up for the mandatory kiss on the cheek. When did we all start kissing each other? She tried to remember when this form of greeting had become common. When she'd been young, she'd only kissed her grandparents and her father, and him only when he'd been drunk and maudlin and had demanded a show of affection. "How's it going?" she asked. They had both sat down and were studying the menu. Jane suddenly felt very hungry. "The landslide must be a bit of a nightmare with the man so close to the slip. Were you okay the day it happened?" "I was at Magnus Tate's funeral." "Of course. Kevin said you were there when the landslide happened. Poor Magnus." Jane had never got to know Magnus, who'd always seemed strange and a little scary,
But Simon had been a regular visitor, and had been the person to call the ambulance the day Magnus had a stroke. "I think he would have rather enjoyed it," Simon said. He had an odd sense of humour. The sight of us scrambling out of the way of the mud, falling over, would have appealed to him. He was never one to stand on his dignity. There was a moment of silence. "I need to ask your advice." Jane looked up, shocked. Simon sometimes gave advice, even if it hadn't been asked for. He'd been trained for it, after all. She couldn't remember him asking for it, though. "I'm not sure if I'll be able to help. What is it?" "Did you hear that a woman was killed in the landslide?" "Of course," Jane said. "She was kind of a neighbour, I suppose." "Did you know her?" He looked at her sideways, waiting for an answer. "Not at all. I don't think she can have been staying in the house for very long." "I met her once," Simon said. "Where? Have you told the police?" Jane thought that the dark woman from Tain was taking over her life. She felt almost as if she were being stalked. How ridiculous was that? It was impossible to be stalked by a dead woman. "No." "You should," Jane said. "They haven't got a name for her yet. I spoke to Jimmy Perez this morning." She paused. "How did you know her?" There was another silence which stretched. The young waiter came with their bill. "I didn't know her, not really." Simon looked out over the water, but it was a very bizarre encounter. She could tell he was about to launch into one of his stories. "What do you mean? Did you visit her at Tain?" "No, nothing like that. I met her in Lerwick, and I'm not even sure that I should be talking about it." "But of course you should." And Jane knew he wanted to talk about it. Simon loved gossip of all kinds. He said that he'd become a psychologist because it gave him a way of prying into other people's lives. "You know, we set up a counselling service for Shetlanders, a small charitable trust. Something outside the health service, which doesn't always have the time or experience to do intensive work. Most of our focus is on families, but we do see individuals too, if that's needed. Individuals in trouble." Jane nodded. Befriending Shetland was one of Simon's projects. A good cause, but sometimes she thought he'd only set it up out of boredom. That restlessness that always needed a challenge. He was still involved, though, still made the trek into Lerwick 3 times a week to run sessions. "We run a drop-in service 1 evening a week," Simon went on. "It's usually me and a volunteer. Often nobody turns up, and we just have a good gossip and drink tea." Another pause. "But that night I was on my own." "And the dead woman came along?" Simon nodded. "When was it?" Jane was fascinated now. 10 days ago." "What did she want?" "I'm not sure I can tell you." He suddenly seemed serious. "It's confidential. That's the big promise we make to everyone who comes to us." "But she's dead." Jane must have spoken more loudly than she intended, because a woman at a far table stared at her. She lowered her voice. "Even if you don't talk to me, you'll have to tell the police." "That's why I wanted your advice. I suppose I knew what you'd say." Simon was staring out of the window. For the first time since she'd joined him in the cafe, he was sitting quite still. "You need to talk to Jimmy Perez. He lives in Ravenswick with Fran Hunter's daughter. You must know him." "I've seen him outside the house, but I've never really talked to him. I called once, after Fran died, but he made it clear he didn't want my company or my help. Perhaps it was just too soon, but I didn't want to go back after that." "I'll come with you if you like," Jane said. "I know him, and I haven't got anything special on this afternoon." She looked at Simon, waiting for his response, and realized that she was holding her breath. She was desperate to go with him to the police station. She wanted to find out everything she could about the dark woman. If Kevin had been visiting her at Tain, this was more than simple curiosity about a dead stranger. She stood up. "Well, are you coming?" Simon hesitated for just a moment longer, and then stood up too. "I suppose," he said. "I haven't really got any choice." Jane hadn't expected to see Jimmy Perez, even though she'd mentioned his name to Simon. She'd thought there would be a junior officer to take statements, but when she explained to the constable on the desk why they were there, Jimmy himself came down to greet them and took them up to his office. He offered them coffee. "It was good to see you at Magnus's funeral, Simon. I know he enjoyed your visits. A pity the burial itself was quite so dramatic. Magnus was always saying that folk were keeping too many sheep on the hill these days," Perez said. "I can imagine him chuckling and saying, 'You see, boys, I told you so.'" Simon smiled. "I was telling Jane that he had an odd sense of humour." Jane had wondered if she might be excluded from the conversation, asked to wait in a different room perhaps, but both Simon and Perez seemed to take it for granted that she would be there. Outside, the sky was brightening a little, and the gulls seemed very white against the grey sky. "So," Perez said, "tell me about your contact with the woman." He leaned back in his chair. "It was by phone first. The organisation has an emergency number. We can't man the line 24 hours. We're not the Samaritans, and we don't have enough volunteers. If no one's around, there's a recorded message, giving our opening hours. But if I'm there, I answer the phone." "What impression did you get from the first call?" Perez paused. "I'm guessing you learn to assess people quickly in your business." "She sounded quite calm," Simon said. "Not inebriated at all, not manic, but there was a kind of quiet desperation in her voice. I suppose I felt that if she talked about taking her life, she might mean it." "And did she talk about taking her life?" "I think her words were, 'I've come to the end, I can't take any more.'" Jane remembered the woman she'd seen in the shop in Bray. She'd seemed calm, cheerful even. What had happened to change her life in the weeks since her contact with Simon? Had it been the man who'd collected her in the car? Had he made the difference to her? A voice in her head was screaming, "At least it wasn't Kevin. If it had been Kevin, you'd have recognized the car even in that weather." "And did she give you her name during that initial phone call?" It was Perez again, as quiet and probing as a psychologist himself. "You said you told her yours." Simon didn't answer at once. "She said her name was Alessandra, but I can't remember when she told me. It could have been over the phone or when she came in later that evening." "Alessandra? You're sure?" Perez seemed especially interested in that. "It was an unusual name," Simon said. "I thought it might be Greek. Of course, it stuck in my memory." Perez gave a little nod. "So she asked if she could come in and talk to you. What did you say?" "That she was welcome to do that, but that I'd only be there until 9:30. "What was the time of the first call?" Perez looked up from his coffee. 8:15. I don't know why, but I always make a note. I told her where to find us, but I had the impression that she'd already checked out our address. It's on the website." "And what time did she arrive?" 20 minutes later." Simon shut his eyes briefly, as if he was remembering the encounter. "We have a waiting area where we can meet people, a couple of easy chairs and a coffee table. On the drop-in evenings we take in a kettle to make tea and coffee. It's less formal than using the offices, where we see people during the day." Perez broke in with a question. "Is that usual? Someone phoning first on a drop-in night?" "It's not unusual." "I'm trying to picture it." Now it was Perez's turn to close his eyes for a moment. "Do clients walk straight in from the pavement?" "There's a buzzer on the door after hours. I wasn't expecting Alessandra to arrive so quickly, and it made me jump rather. I hurried to let her in. Of course, it was dark and raining, and I didn't want her to stand outside getting wetter than she already was. Once again, first impressions, please, if you wouldn't mind." "Honestly," Simon said, "that she was a very beautiful woman. When I let her in, she was wearing a long coat. She took the coat off and shook it. and I saw her long dark hair and almost black eyes. When I saw the drawing you've been circulating, I recognized her immediately. There was no doubt in my mind. There was a pause, and he resumed his story of that night. At first, I didn't think the person who walked in was the same woman who'd phoned. She seemed too confident and too controlled, not in need of our help. But as she came further into the room, she began to cry, almost silently, and then she gave a sob and held a handkerchief to her mouth as if the sound had been obscene and she needed to stop it happening again. What age would you say? Perez's voice was very quiet, and Jane, furthest away from him, struggled to make out the words. Early 40s? It was hard to tell. What did you do? Nothing at first. We both sat down, and I waited for her to compose herself. There was a box of tissues on the table, and I pushed it towards her. Eventually, she started to speak. There was a silence in Jimmy Perez's room. Jane supposed it was similar to the silence in the charity's office as Simon waited for the woman to explain why she was so desperate. She thought Simon, in work mode, must be very different from the man she knew. That Simon was impatient and never waited for anyone. Now, the psychologist continued. First, she apologized for being so emotional. She said she'd got into a mess and she could see no way out, apart from killing herself. What sort of mess? Simon shook his head. I'm sorry, Jimmy, but she wasn't very specific. There seemed to be a lot of guilt. She talked about being trapped and about being worried about her family. She kept saying it was all her fault. Then suddenly she was quite calm again, as she'd appeared to be on the phone and when I'd first opened the door to her. She stood up and put on her coat. She'd put it over a chair close to the radiator, and I remember seeing it steaming while we were talking. She said, of course, she wouldn't kill herself. There were people who depended on her, people who loved her. She'd panicked for a while, that was all. Now she felt rather foolish for taking up my time. She shook my hand as if we'd been having a professional meeting, and she left. I called after her that she should ring back if ever she wanted to talk again, if ever she felt that she couldn't cope on her own, but she didn't reply. There was silence, and once more Jane could picture the scene in the charity's office, the rain on the windowpane, the steam rising from the stylish coat, the box of tissues on the low table. Then the woman suddenly becoming quite controlled, almost dignified, and walking away into the night. Is that how the woman appeared to you? Perez asked. Like a professional woman? If you were to guess what work she did, what would you say? I suppose I assumed she was in the oil or gas business. Simon seemed surprised by the question. Because of the way she spoke, her confidence once the tears were over. I imagined her heading up a team, having a certain responsibility. Alessandra's a foreign name, as you say, Southern Mediterranean. Did she have an accent? Simon paused for a moment. His voice was upper-class English. Sometimes Jane teased him about it. Perhaps there was a trace of an accent, but if she came from overseas, her English was very good. Did you arrange to meet again? There was a moment of silence. No, Simon said. I never expected to see her again. Chapter 9. Perez walked to collect Cassie on Friday night. The Rogerson house was close to the police station and glimpsed domestic scenes through uncurtained windows along the street. Happy families. Maybe. The door was opened by Catherine's father, Tom. Perez knew him by sight and had bumped into him at a couple of meetings. Tom was a solicitor, senior partner in a firm of lawyers who dealt with everything from divorce to crime, but much of his work seemed to involve one of the contractors at Sullom Voe. Perez served on a council working group that planned for disaster if a tanker should hit the rocks or there was a major oil spill at the terminal, and Tom Rogerson was often present, either representing the contractor or in his role as counsellor. It seemed ironic now that nobody had planned for the disaster of a landslide triggered by natural causes. Tom had worked in the south straight after university and only came home when his daughter was born. "Where better to bring up a child," he'd said when he first met Perez and found out that he had a stepdaughter. "I loved the freedom of being a kid here, and my wife's an Orcadian, so she felt just the same. It meant a drop in salary, but money's not everything. Isn't that right, Jimmy?" Now he stepped back to let Perez into the house. Perez remembered that they'd met on social occasions too, at a couple of weddings, one a marathon affair in Walsey. Tom Rogerson was a great dancer, very light on his feet, and even just stepping away from the door, he moved as if he had music in his head. "That Cassie's a fine young lassie. The women have enjoyed every minute of having her here." "I'm very grateful," Perez said, "but I hope the school will reopen on Monday and I won't have to impose on you again." He realised that he sounded a little stuffy. Willow Reeves would have pulled a face and laughed at him if she were there. "Aye, well, Catherine will know more about that. I've not long got in from work. You'll stay for a cup of tea, Jimmy?" And before Perez could answer, he was shouting through to the kitchen, "Put the kettle on, Mavis. The inspector has arrived for the bairn." This time, Cassie was in the living room with a big box of dressing-up clothes. Catherine had propped a long mirror against the wall so that the child could look at herself. As he walked past, Perez stuck his head in the room to say hello, but Cassie was engrossed in fastening a silk princess dress with a wide blue ribbon, and only waved. Catherine was in the kitchen drinking tea with her mother. "Cassie looks as if she's having fun." Was he a failure as a father because he'd never thought Cassie might like dressing up? "I work with the youth theatre, the little ones, and there are always lots of costumes in the house." A pause. "She hasn't been in all day, though. It cleared up a bit this afternoon, so we went for a walk." "I'm sure she's had a great time." The kettle squealed, and Mavis refilled a big china pot standing on the Rayburn. "Help yourself to a scone, Jimmy. They're just out of the oven." He wanted to collect Cassie and take her home. In the quiet of his own house, he could reflect on the information provided by Simon Agnew. But Perez knew it would be rude to insist on leaving without taking the tea and at least one scone. This family had provided free childcare for 2 days, and the least he could do was accept their hospitality. "They're saying that the woman swept away from Tain by the landslide was murdered," Tom said. "Is that right, Jimmy?" Perez didn't ask who'd passed on that information. In Shetland, news spread like a virus. "The death's been treated as suspicious." He realised he sounded pompous again. "You don't know anything about her? We think she was staying at Tain." Then there was a sudden thought, and he turned to Catherine. This was something he should have checked before, even though James Grieve had said the dead woman had never given birth. "You didn't have any kids in the school from there, did you?" Catherine shook her head. "We haven't had any new children since I started, and none of our pupils live in Tain." "What about you, Tom? Did you ever meet the woman? Dark hair, exotic looking, not local?" Because Tom Rogerson seemed to know everyone. He provided a bridge between islanders and soothmouthers, the oil industry and environmentalists. With his easy manner and charm, he would invite confidences and gossip. "Don't remember meeting her, Jimmy. And from the sound of her, I would remember, eh?" He gave a roguish smile, and what was almost a wink. Perez glanced at Mavis Rogerson, but there was no response. He'd heard rumours that Tom was a bit of a ladies' man, but perhaps he just enjoyed the reputation and played up to it. Perez thought Mavis Rogerson would know better than to take a daft middle-aged man's showing off too seriously. "You haven't heard anything about the woman?" he asked. "We still don't have a name for her, but we think she might be called Alessandra, maybe Alice for short." The woman only shook her head. "I'm sorry, Jimmy. I only work a couple of stints in the Red Cross shop these days. I'm sure I haven't had a customer like your woman." Perez wondered what it must be like to have a husband like Tom Rogerson, who was out at meetings most nights, while Mavis herself had little reason to leave this dark and rather claustrophobic house in the winter. "We've been told the school can open as usual on Monday," Catherine said. Perez was pleased he wouldn't have to make the visit to the Rogerson home a regular event. The news made him feel suddenly gracious. He took another mug of tea and congratulated Mavis on her baking, but when he left soon afterwards with Cassie, it was with a sense of freedom. Life was slowly coming back to normal. The following day, Cassie had been invited to spend the weekend with some friends, and Willow Reeves would arrive. Willow phoned soon after he'd put Cassie to bed. He'd lit the fire and the house was warm. "I've been working all day on your behalf, Inspector." "We think we have a first name for her," he said. "Alessandra. I'm wondering if she could be American, the owner of the cottage that was destroyed in the landslide." Perez wondered why he was so resistant to that idea, because he'd had a romantic notion about a Spanish beauty who was a stranger to the islands, not a middle-aged American with an aunt who was a Shetlander. Not someone northern, restrained and buttoned up, checking out that her inheritance was safe. "Ha! Well, that checks out with what we have." Willow sounded triumphant. "An Alessandra Secrist was booked on the ferry at the beginning of January. I assume that she's your victim. Boat passengers don't have to show any ID, but it'd be too much of a coincidence if it was a different woman." So now they had a name for her. They'd be able to check with Craig Henderson, the last tenant of Tain, if she was the owner of the croft. But again, Perez felt slightly disappointed. Secrist wasn't a southern European name. He felt his dream of the dead woman slipping away from him. Instead, she was taking on a completely new identity. "She called Befriending Shetland, a counselling charity, the week before she died," he said. "It seems she was contemplating suicide." "But her death was murder. According to James Grieve, there's no doubt about that." Perez stretched out his legs towards the fire. "And when she was last seen, the day before the landslide, she seemed almost cheerful." "Ah, we can all put on a show when we need to. It doesn't stop us being desperate inside." Perez didn't know how to answer that. He couldn't imagine Willow Reeves ever feeling desperate. She was the strongest and most resilient person he'd ever met. "I'll be at the airport to meet you tomorrow," he said. "We can stop and look at the scene on the way back to Lerwick." There was a brief silence at the end of the phone. "I'll look forward to it, Jimmy." It was lightly said, but he could tell that she meant it. He was about to answer, but the line had already gone dead. Craig Henderson, Tain's previous tenant, arrived at Sumborough from Aberdeen an hour before Willow was scheduled to come in from Inverness. It was a brighter day and the planes were all on time, flying from the east and landing into the wind. Sandy was with Perez, though they'd driven separately to the airport. Sandy had been at school with Craig and gave a wave of recognition as the man sauntered up at the baggage belt. He was brown and fit, and his hand luggage was a smart leather hold-all. He'd have looked more at home in Dubai than Sumborough. Perez watched the encounter between the younger men from a distance. It was civil enough, but he could tell they weren't bosom pals. Sandy led Craig towards an office they'd borrowed from the airport staff. That was when Perez joined them and introduced himself. "So, I get the big boss, do I?" Craig said. "Do they not trust you to do the job yourself, Sandy? Do you need a minder these days? Well, that figures." He took a seat by the desk. The office was near the departure lounge and looked out over the runway. An Eastern Airways charter had just brought in a group of workers for Sullom Voe, and they were walking from the plane towards the airport building. There was a moment of silence, broken by Craig. "What's this about, Sandy? What am I supposed to have done? I've been away for 6 months, so I don't think you can pin anything on me this time." His voice still had a Shetland accent, the tone amused, a little arrogant. Perez had looked up Henderson's record. He'd been charged for fighting in a bar in Lerwick, and Sandy had been the arresting officer, so that explained the needle. "We're after a bit of information," Sandy said. "That's all. And it couldn't have waited for a few hours until I got home, had a shower and a beer." Craig looked up suddenly and his voice changed. "Has anything happened to one of the family? Has my father taken ill again? He had a heart attack a year ago, but he seems to have been fine since then." "Nothing like that." Sandy shook his head. Have you heard about the landslide that blocked the Sunborough Road for a couple of days? My mother texted me about it, but I only picked up the message when I got to Aberdeen. The slide went straight through Tain, completely wrecked the house, and we found the body of a woman in the garden. You were the last person to rent the house. We're still trying to identify the woman, and we thought you might be able to help. How did you come to be living there?" Perez was sitting away from the table, and he found his mind wandering. By now, Willow should be aboard the plane in Inverness. It should even have taken off. He had to force his attention back into the room. Craig was speaking. "I work away on contract in the Middle East. 6 months on and 3 months off. It suits me just fine. At the end of my leave in Shetland, I'm desperate to get back to work, and the money's good. My folks would be happy for me to spend all my leave with them, but they make me feel like a bairn again. They want to know when I'll be in for my tea and if I'm going to be back for the night, and there's always pressure to have me back working for the family business. Kind of cramps my style. So, last time I was home, I rented the house at Tain. Close enough to get to my mother's for her to do the laundry, but my own space. You know what I mean?" A grin, to show that he was only being half serious. Sandy nodded. "How did you come to rent that place in particular? I can't find any record of it being advertised as being up for let." "Old Magnus Tate told me about it." The room fell quiet until Sandy spoke. His voice was soft. "Did you hear that Magnus had died?" There was another moment of silence before the man replied. "Nah. That he had a stroke right at the end of my last leave, and my mother told me he never really got over it. I'm not surprised. I'll miss our chats, though." "They were burying Magnus when the landslide hit," Sandy said. "You know that Tain is just up the hill from the cemetery." "Poor old bugger." "Were you friends?" Perez asked. "I suppose we were, in a way. When I was home last, I saw him struggling to clip his sheep and offered to help. He was an old man. Still strong, but the arthritis had got into his fingers and his wrists, and he found it hard to manage. I used to give my grandfather a hand when I was a boy. He had a croft, out at Nibbin." There was a moment of hesitation, while Craig seemed to be remembering happy times. "Magnus didn't say much while we were working, but he took me into the house for a dram afterwards. It was just as it must have been 100 years ago. I felt as if I was stepping back in time. And then he started telling us stories about the old days. Fascinating. It was just like talking to my granddad when he was alive. My folks aren't interested in any of that. They just want the new kitchen every couple of years and their holiday to Spain in the summer. Money for a flash, showy car." Craig paused again. "I'd go round to see Magnus some evenings, take a bottle with me. He'd ask about my work abroad, and then after a couple of drams he'd start with his stories." "And he suggested Tain might be available for rent." Perez turned his back on the runway and leaned towards the desk where Sandy and Craig were sitting. "He was the same generation as Minnie Lawrenson, who used to live there. I remember her. Always dressed in black with a hooked nose so she looked like a raven. She seemed ancient even when I was a peery boy. She died a peery while ago. She didn't have any relatives left in Shetland. She'd never married. Tain was empty after she'd died. Magnus told me it had gone to a niece, some kind of niece, the daughter of a cousin maybe. You know what it's like with Shetlanders, Jimmy. We're all related if you dig back far enough. Anyway, this woman lived in America, and Magnus said she might let me stay there. He could tell I was restless at home and needed my own space. "I lived with my mother for too long," he said to me. "A man needs a house of his own." "Did Magnus give you the address of the owner?" "Yes, Minnie had written it down for him. She never trusted lawyers, apparently. She asked Magnus to write to the woman in America when she died, to tell her that Tain was hers. He did that, and they'd been in touch ever since." Was that why she was in Shetland? Perez wondered. Because she knew that Magnus was dying, and she wanted to meet him before it was too late. And then perhaps she intended to go to his funeral, but she never made it to the kirk because she was killed. What was her name? She called herself Sandy. I'm not sure what that was short for. Sandy Sechrist, her name was. I phoned her and asked if I could stay in the place. I told her I'd do it up for her a bit, so at least it would be fit for her to stay in if she came over. She said if I was prepared to do that, I could have it rent-free. Just pay for any fuel I used. I hadn't offered the work for any return, but I get bored easily, and when I'm bored, I get into bother. He shot another quick grin in Sandy's direction. Did you ever meet her? Craig shook his head. She talked about coming over, but in the end something got in the way. Work, I think. What did she do for work? She was a publisher based in New York. Did you ever see a photo? Because Perez was struggling to reconcile the dark-eyed woman he'd imagined with a publisher from New York. No. Why